What's up, man? Hope y'all are having a wonderful day. I'm super excited about today's show. My goal with this show is to introduce you to the men who build the world and create lives of impact so that we can celebrate them and work together to fulfill the call of masculinity in our homes, our communities, and the world. This episode is focused on exploring how to end abortion in our lifetime and men's role and responsibility in this mission. All right, today's guest is the president of Human Coalition, a technology-driven, life-affirming nonprofit organization. He has authored 4 books, including Abortion, The Ultimate Exploitation of Women, and Deliver Us from Abortion, Awakening the Church to End the Killing of America's Children. And he's appeared in the Washington Post, Fox News, CBN News, and other major publications addressing the abortion issue. He is also the host of the Human Element Show, which you can find online. We can kind of talk about that later. And that is distributed as a podcast, a video podcast, and a radio program. So please help me in welcoming Brian Fisher. Brian, thank you so much for being here, my man.
Hey, thanks, Corey. It's great to be with you guys today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you, man. So I know there's a lot that I left out there, and I want to kind of take a deep dive into that. But I really want to start out real quick with just your role in kind of corporate America and how you started out, before getting into the Human Coalition and Online for Life.
Yeah, well, believe it or not, my college degree is in classical piano. So I was a musician and thought I was going to be the next, Michael W. Smith or somebody like that. And then at some point figured out that I don't look like him and I can't sing. So that dream died. But when I got out of school, I worked in Christian radio for several years and then got recruited into the finance world. So most of my early career was in the financial securities industry, so stocks and bonds and insurance and whatnot. And I was fortunate enough to be hired into a startup firm and then became a partner in that. I had a great run in the securities industry, and then we sold the company, and that put me on a new path. So spent 2 years running a large nonprofit in Florida and then moved to Dallas back in 2008 and was the COO of a marketing agency before this really began to take off. So it's kind of a potpourri of a career, but looking back now, I can see God's hand at work training me in lots of different areas to get me ready for the adventure of the Human Coalition. Yeah.
It's funny how that happens, isn't it? It's kind of like there can be stages of our life where we kind of feel like, man, maybe there's something going on here that is bigger than me, and then it kind of starts to show itself. So that's interesting. So what was the catalyst? Because you had all of the big business experience and very at the high level too. You were at the, in the COO position, VP level at that marketing agency, right? Or was it some other position, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. So what was the catalyst that made you decide to go from corporate, executive to the wild world of entrepreneurship and, more specifically the nonprofit world?
Well, I think it was just the Lord sort of gently and sometimes not so gently prodding me to care. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I was, like most of us, we're trying to build our careers and provide for our families, and
sure,
we're sort of jazzed about, the egocentric nature of business, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, when you're in that age, you're fairly self-assured, whether we should be or not.
Right.
And, I'd always been pro-life. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home and had a great upbringing, but it didn't impact me. I don't ever recall knowing anybody or knowing about anybody that had an abortion. I'm sure I did. I just didn't know it.
Yeah.
But in 2007, I was the president of a large nonprofit in Florida, and that's where we began to test the idea of using technology to reach women who are high at risk to abort to see if we could save some babies. And that was really, I had known about the pro-life movement. I was a donor to the pro-life movement, but 2007 was the first time where I actually got involved. And so when Jess and I and the boys moved to Dallas in 2008, I was back in the business world and having fun, and God, not so gently said, I want you to keep that work. I want you to keep doing that test. I want you to keep reaching women who are high at risk to abort. And so, I had a full-time great paying job. It was a awesome company. I had a fantastic ownership. And at the same time on the side, I'm starting Human Coalition as basically a volunteer project. And the first baby was rescued on June 22nd, 2010. And that was my catalytic moment. When I got word that we had helped to rescue a human being from death in the womb, I was just broken and emotionally, spiritually broken because A lot of the complaining I had done about being involved up to that point really melted away. And it was really in that moment where I thought, you know what, I need to pledge my life to ending abortion and get out of the work that I'm in. And so it took a few years, but God in his faithfulness allowed me to take that journey, and I've been here ever since.
That's huge. And I know that we'll get into that, but the numbers and stuff have drastically increased since then, as far as the number of lives that you've been able to be a part of saving. So that's cool. So I want to take a step back real quick, because I'm not sure that every listener right now is old enough maybe, or even involved enough to understand exactly what this is. And I think this question is important. So what is Roe versus Wade, and why was it so instrumental as a flag in the ground, so to speak, for the rise of legal abortion in this country?
Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court decision from 1973, and it, along with a companion case, Doe v. Bolton, those two cases together, which were both in that same year, legalized abortion on demand for any reason in the United States. So it is the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made in its history, and they've made some bad ones, including Dred Scott, but no decision has had the result of 61 million dead Americans as, in its wake. So that decision reversed most states' laws which had prohibitions against abortion. It basically struck them all down and said, no, this is now a federal issue. And the federal courts basically usurped state authority and said, we're going to legalize abortion. In practicality, what it said is that a woman is a parent from conception, but a man isn't a parent until birth. It removed the man from the equation entirely. And unfortunately, all too many men are fine with that. But in some cases, it gets rather sorrowful when the man wants the child and has no legal standing to protect his own son or daughter in the womb. But you're talking about a decision that was made by a bunch of men and was really foisted on the American culture in the span of a decade, from the mid-'60s till 73. And since then, it's brought nothing but misery, heartache, and death.
So that the adoption of that, like you just said, I mean, what do you think is behind that big push now? I don't know how it was back after 1973 and how quick people were to adopt the concept of abortion. And I didn't do any research on, like, number wise how it's grown over the years. But what do you think is behind that almost celebratory rite of passage and human progressive? They see it as a human right, for progressive women. Like, what is that they are digging their teeth into, to where this is like something to be celebrated rather than to,
Well, it's been brilliantly marketed. The reality is that the abortion culture in America was driven by racism and by men's sexual appetites. So you have Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, which is the country's largest abortion provider, kills 330,000 children a year. She was a racist, and she started the first birth control clinic in New York in 1916, and that grew into Planned Parenthood. Her mindset, her worldview, was based on the fact that certain races should be allowed to populate and certain races should not. And in her mind, the black population needed to be stemmed, and she's quoted as saying that we need to stop them from populating. So you have a deep, deep racist agenda that was manifesting itself. Bunch of white, rich men whose names we'd recognize were funding this whole thing, Rockefeller, others. And that complemented the sexual revolution very, very well. The sexual revolution, birthed in the late 50s, early 60s, basically tore down the traditional view of marriage and sexuality. And men were beginning to realize that, they could sleep with whoever they wanted to without consequence. For them, abortion is like the best get out of jail free card ever. Right. You can sleep around, you can impregnate whoever you want, and not only do you have no legal obligation, you have no legal right. And so if you are your guy that refuses to keep his pants on and doesn't want to abide by honoring women, then this was the perfect setup. So it's ironic that today, 40 some years later, our culture celebrates abortion as a woman's right. That's not the agenda. The agenda is to keep the black population at bay and to allow white men to sleep with whoever they want to. It's still that agenda today. It's just now been brilliantly couched in this idea of reproductive rights and women's health care. It has virtually nothing to do with those things.
That's interesting. So with your marketing background and having the business background and all that, and recognizing that typically you're saying how brilliantly marketed and executed it was, like your whole business model is built off of marketing,
Yep.
and catching people who are at the high risk to abort and or women primarily. Like, what is it? How do you combat that? Because I've been in marketing for, almost a decade now, and it's not easy to come in there and uproot something that's so just solidified. It's like trying to say some Coke company or cola company coming in and saying they're going to uproot Coca-Cola, right, and turn it on its head. And then that's just, like, not to say that's what you're doing, but I'm just like, how do you even go against that David and Goliath battle, right, and see an end in mind with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So Planned Parenthood, which is our competitor, their annual budget is $1.6 billion.
Wow.
So, and they kill 330,000 children a year. So they have unbelievably deep tentacles into churches, frankly, government, state and federal government, the family, media. They have deep roots into Hollywood. So they are the Goliath. And Human Coalition, the organization that I serve, is the largest pro-life organization in the country,
right?
But it's 1/100th of Planned Parenthood size.
Wow.
So we're 1/100th the size of our competitor. So your question is very poignant. The answer, however, is probably not as complicated as some might think, because the abortion industry is based entirely on lies,
right?
And it's based entirely on treating women as profit margins, basically. So the abortion industry sees women as victims to be exploited so they can make money and they can achieve their agendas. So we come along and we say, hey, look, we care deeply about women and their children. We're going to love you. We're going to care for you. We're not going to leave you. We're not going to ditch you when we're done with you. We're not going to exploit you. We're going to provide you truth about what abortion is and what it means for you and your child. But we're also going to be the hands and feet of the gospel, and we're going to walk with you as long as you need us. Maybe that's through the pregnancy. Maybe that's after the pregnancy. We're going to find you a maternity home. We're going to find you a mentor. We're going to find you drug and alcohol abuse counseling. We're going to find you housing. We go the extra mile where Planned Parenthood says, here's a birth control pill. If that doesn't work, come back and we'll take care of your baby. See ya. And we're going to charge you to do it. So it's not, it's the truth and love win out. And so our marketing is based on that truthfulness about what abortion is and loving these women, even when they're in the most desperate set of circumstances.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to that. One, the lie that's being perpetuated is also the easy path, right? And being in kind of any personal development or anything like that, very few people ever really take the hard path, which is the most productive, long-term and all that. But when there's that easier solution, most people aren't conditioned to go that direction, right? So I totally see that and am sympathetic to that. So I was kind of thinking before the show, really, like, at the end of the day, like inside of marketing and the companies that I've worked with, my brain is really conditioned to try to surpass all the surface level stuff and like what is the response to some situation and try to get down to the root of what's actually happening. And so you guys are dealing with, I don't know, how many women do y'all see or have you seen maybe since the inception? Or do you know?
It's in the tens of thousands. I don't know what the current number is. I think we're serving somewhere around 1,800 women a month. That's
amazing. So you have a good handle on kind of the overarching real reasons why a woman, not just, hey, I don't know what to do, but there's probably more fundamental aspects of that.
For sure.
What are those? And then, well, let's get into that. What are those typically first?
Well, I think it's important for us to understand that when we watch the news and we see an abortion activist, right? You see Alyssa Milano, or you see some of these Hollywood actors and actresses, or you see a march in Washington and you got women wearing vaginas on their heads. That's not the woman in America who is at risk to abort. Right. They may have been at one time. I suspect most of those women have had abortions and they take such an emotional position because they need to justify themselves. But the women that we deal with are women who are in very difficult circumstances. They're not activists. They're not trying to make a political point. They're trying to solve their problem. And their problem is that they got pregnant by a guy who probably isn't around anymore or is threatening to leave or doesn't want the baby. Mm-hmm. And they're just trying to figure out how to keep their lives together. They're trying to figure out how to maintain their relationships. They're trying to figure out how to pay their bills, how to keep their lights on. 75% of our clients are mothers, so they're trying to figure out how to provide for their kids, for their born children.
Yeah.
So their drivers are typically relational and financial, or at least that's their perception. And most of the time that aligns with their reality. They are scared they're going to lose their relationships, and they're scared that they're not going to be able to provide for themselves or their families. So, we have to kind of have a sober mind about this, because oftentimes men are so reluctant to get involved in pro-life work because they don't want to be seen as, misogynistic or something. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is meeting the needs of vulnerable women and their children, and doing it in a way that is non-judgmental and that recognizes that their decision to come to that abortion decision, their process of getting to that, is not political. It's, I don't know what to do. This seems to be the safest and easiest way out. And that's what they've been trained by the culture for years.
It's interesting. So a lot of what's going on with what you said, like the vagina hat and all that kind of stuff, is just more of a distraction from what's actually happening and really the solution even, it sounds like. Well,
the abortion industry, again, are masters of deflection. If you watch, and abortion is in the news every day now, if you watch the coverage that's going on in, New York or Virginia, or some of the stuff that's happening in Alabama, and you listen to the rhetoric of the pro-abortion movement, they never, ever, ever, ever mention the baby. They just disregard that the baby exists at all. It's not. We're not going to talk about their humanity. We're not going to talk about whether or not it's a clump of cells. They just ignore the child altogether. It's women's health care. It's reproductive rights. It's women. That's all calculated. So yes, it's based on distracting, because the last thing that this culture wants you and me, men, to realize is that we've killed 61 million of our kids.
Right.
And we've killed 61 million of our kids.
Yeah. And that, at the end of the day, is ground zero for everything. Right. So you mentioned this, but with the Alabama deal, right now we're seeing some states take really, really bold stances, like in the direction of pro-life. And I think that's awesome, but they're catching a lot of flack. So it takes a really strong leader to do that in the first place. I'm kind of wondering, from your perspective, one, your take on that as a whole, because like with this thing with Alabama, like they had a 25-6 vote in the Senate that passed through just yesterday, which is like exciting. I don't know what it's going to have to go through to actually become law, or is that pretty much it, or does it have the point of being vetoed at this point? And that's kind of
no. They Georgia, Alabama, Ohio, some of these other states that are passing aggressive pro-life laws. It's all part of a calculated strategy to get a case or two up to the Supreme Court. So they're all going to get sued. They all know that.
Okay.
But it's intentional, because they want to fast track as many of these up to the Supreme Court as well.
That's awesome. Okay. And hopefully with the Trump administration, and having a somewhat, unbiased, I don't know if it'd be unbiased, but at least it biased in our direction, like we might have an opportunity to kind of pass some new legislation there, you think? Or
the idea is that with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh now on the court, supposedly the court is leaning more towards a constructionist court. You can call it conservative. I think it's probably better to say originalist or constructionist, meaning the Supreme Court is supposed to function according to the Constitution, in that its job is to interpret laws, not to make laws. Now, this has been a debate in our country for 50 years, and a liberal mindset would say, well, no, we want the judges to be creating laws, and they have empowered the judicial system well beyond what the founders intended. At the Supreme Court level, the idea is that, with the 5 justices who tend towards conservatism, they are originalists. If you get a pro-life law contested and sent up to the Supreme Court, you have a chance at chipping away at Roe, which is judicial activism at its deadliest. It's horrible law. Even liberal scholars reading Roe think it's terrible law. They might agree with it, but they think the law itself is just so poorly constructed.
Wow.
So the idea is that states that tend towards pro-life are intentionally pushing as much pro-life legislation as they can to basically compel the Supreme Court to begin to take a very serious look at Roe and see if there are pieces of that which can be unwound. And so these are all calculated, good, positive steps. We support them, obviously. We want abortion unthinkable and unavailable in our lifetime, and there has to be a legislative piece of that. And so we applaud Governor Kemp and Governor of Ohio, Governor of Alabama, and some other states that are considering legislation. Whether or not the Supreme Court takes the case, yet to be known. And frankly, I'm probably not as bullish on the Supreme Court as others are. We got a couple guys on there that concern me. I'd love to see at least one more good justice appointed, but we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so with the boldness of these states that are stepping up to do that, do you think that's going to empower other states to take that step? I look at Texas, for example, where you and I are both based, and it's like, why haven't we taken that step? First of all, like we should be leading the charge, I would just, think, in something like that. But
well, it's always political, so there are reasons why Texas hasn't taken that step. That's probably a conversation for another day. But the reality is that politicians behave politically. So if it's not politically, unfortunately, and I'm not saying that politicians have no morals or no values. I'm saying that pro-life politicians are still subject to the winds of politics. And if the governor of a state like Georgia is firmly pro-life and Governor Kemp is, and you have a constitution, a makeup of the Congress there that politically sees it advantageous to advance pro-life legislation, is going to happen. In Texas, where we have a very pro-life governor, obviously we have at the moment a Congress which is not feeling the confidence politically put forth that type of legislation that they think is going to get passed. There's lots of pro-life bills in Austin right now, but very few of them have the political power to get through.
So you mentioned earlier about the we kind of both mentioned, I guess, but the progressives and the kind of the movement behind all of this, and kind of that whole movement in a lot of ways is, and I want to be polite here, but it's just disgusting, a lot of the way that they kind of embrace it and the way they're projecting out, and it's almost like they come off, at least from my opinion, as a bunch of like murderous, like bloodthirsty people, right? And I don't mean to judge them so much as just to say like that's what it comes off as, right? And then, but inside of that, obviously, and you're seen as kind of the devil in their eyes in a lot of ways. I was doing some research on you, and you're like, I was saying when the devil's calling the devil, like that's a good thing in my opinion, right? Right? It's kind of there's this you're doing things that I love, right, in that regard, because you're not afraid to put yourself out there and kind of be the target, and you have a good system behind that. So how do you keep from letting that get personal and battling people versus battling ideas?
Well, it's the gospel. So Christ is the author of life, and John 10:10 tells us the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy, but Christ came that we might have life and have it abundantly. So, I don't take nearly as many shots as many of my companions in the pro-life movement for lots of different reasons. And the shots that I take are mainly, I feel sad because, we really shouldn't expect somebody that doesn't know Christ to have a pro-life worldview. There are some that do, and I'm grateful for them, and we've partnered with them and have great relationships. But it would be odd for us to assume that somebody that doesn't accept the idea of a creator, or that we have value outside of ourselves, or that we are uniquely made to have a problem with abortion. I mean, there's a rationality to it if you don't have a Christian worldview. It's obviously deeply flawed and genocidal, but there's some rationality to it.
Right.
The challenge, I think, for those of us in leadership in the pro-life movement is when Christians are the ones that are pro-abortion, and there's a ton of pro-abortion Christians. That's where I get angry. That's where I get hacked off, and I lose my temper and my patience, because if you're going to claim to follow Christ and you claim to be pro-abortion, you either aren't a Christian or you have an extraordinary dearth of theological understanding. Right. And your church is probably a mess. So those types of emails and calls that I get bother me a lot, whereas the angry emails and stuff that I get from pro-abortion advocates, I try to engage them in conversation, again, because the abortion argument is entirely emotional and nonsensical. It usually doesn't go anywhere. But those that claim to follow Christ and still support abortion rights, that's a tough one for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that's more from a leadership perspective, or is that just personally their beliefs and they're probably going to some kind of a church? I mean, is it, I guess that's the issue, right? Is it more the churches or the people inside of the churches? Because at the end of the day, I think personal responsibility is always plays a huge key and a huge part of this, right?
Yeah. The church in America on the whole, not every church, but the church
I
on the
got you.
whole in America does not see abortion as something that they should address. And I've had this conversation 1,500 times. Modern day pastors, modern day priests, for the most part, don't want to talk about abortion. So what you produce, even if you're evangelical, even if you're biblically orthodox on other issues, you have ignorant congregations. Because
Right.
where else are they going to hear the truth about abortion if they're not going to hear it in church? The answer is nowhere, because the culture is screaming abortion rights to them. So if a pastor or priest doesn't have the courage to stand up and talk about the greatest genocide in American history from a spiritual context, chances are your congregation isn't going to know or understand the Christian worldview related to abortion, and chances are they're going to have either an overtly pro-abortion view or what they think is a neutral view. And on this topic, a neutral view is a pro-abortion view. So you have a tremendous lack of courage in the Christian church on behalf of most pastors and priests, in my view, and I think that's been well documented, which is producing silent Christians, which are standing by while we kill 3,000 babies every day. That's the result when churches don't adhere to scriptural teaching on abortion.
So, I mean, I get it. Like, how do we change that? Because, you know, and this is a little bit of a diversion because I want to focus on how men have this role, but that is a key part of this is inside of the church. I mean, you're talking with these guys every day, like, you're saying that they don't want to address that. What is it that they don't want to address about that they don't feel like is their role, or they just don't want to put people in a position where they're going to walk away feeling shamed, or like, what's the big catalyst there?
Yeah, it's all those. I mean, there's, you know, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have given a much more compassionate answer.
Yeah.
There's no good reason. So the pastor himself or priest doesn't know, and I'm Protestant, but we deal with both Catholics and Protestants. They just don't understand what abortion is. They don't understand that at least a third of their congregation is post-abortive. They don't understand that abortion is the leading cause of death in America, that it's killed 61 million people. They just don't know. Oftentimes it's ignorance. Oftentimes, though, the leadership of the church is making a calculation. They're saying, what are the risks if we address this? And I'm talking about even once a year on Sanctity of Life Sunday. I'm not talking about all the time like a Matt Chandler or, you know, Todd Wagner would do. These guys are saying I could make some people feel bad, and I don't want to do that. They could be saying I have some major donors who are in favor of abortion rights. I don't want to lose the money. That often factors into the decision. Or I just don't want to deal with the angry emails and incensed people that might result if I preach and teach on abortion. You know, my point is that the Christian worldview is the foundation of the pro-life worldview. You can be pro-life and not be Christian, but the pro-life worldview is founded and grounded in Christianity. If abortion is not a primary topic for evangelical Christian churches in America, why are we surprised that we're killing 3,000 kids a day? Like, who else is going to deliver that message? Right. But pastors and priests and church leaders, they just don't want to deal with it. In many cases, they honestly don't see it as something that they should be addressing. They think the government should address it. They think that somebody else should address it. And, you know, I'm at the point in my life in my mid-40s, having fought this battle for a long time. You know, we got to go to the laity. We have to go to the grassroots. We need a groundswell from the ground up, because there are some fantastic, really great church leaders who are doing good work on this. Yeah. But it is an infinitesimal fraction of what we need. And the grassroots is probably where the power and the strength and the influence really needs to come from.
That's good, man. So are you guys focused primarily on like local and state influence? Are y'all doing anything from the federal level? Or?
It's all the above. Yeah. So we have a small team in DC that works the federal government level. And then we have a team here in Dallas that works different state capitals. And they'll run around and talk to different reps and whatnot when sessions are in. So, and then locally, you know, we're getting ramped up to do some pretty exciting things at the grassroots. But my guess is that we're going to see the majority of successes at the grassroots level.
Yeah.
Because people are really concerned. Look, there's a lot of, I hear from them every day, honestly, Corey, every day. I get emails, I get messages on my blog, I get, Facebook messages from people all over the country that are frustrated as heck at their churches, and they're frustrated as heck at their pro-life politicians.
Yeah.
They've had enough and they want to join something. And we want to give them an opportunity to come together and to do that.
Yeah, that's the interesting part about kind of what we were talking about earlier with like the Alyssa Milanos and all the people that are making it such a big deal out of this whole thing being a women's rights is I don't think it's doing what they think that it's doing. I think what it's doing is igniting the grassroots like you were talking about and really like it's putting something inside of them that they want to change. They just don't know how. And as big as you guys have gotten and being, the greatest threat to abortion that exists out there, there's still a lot of people that don't know who you are, right?
We joke that we're the largest pro-life organization in the country that no one's ever heard of.
Yeah.
Because historically we've not been engaged politically in the press a whole lot. I think it's causing a daily conversation about abortion, which is also causing an increased polarization.
Right.
So while there are great gains being made, as you said, in states legislatively, there's also great pain being caused in other states. If you look at what New York has done, if you look at what Virginia is attempting to do, if you look at what California is doing, you're seeing as much aggression on the pro-life side. You're seeing equal, if not more so, aggression on the pro-abortion side because they're trying to get as many radical laws passed in favor of abortion rights as possible, because if Roe goes down, this all goes back to the states, and they're trying to lock in their state right to abortion.
Gotcha.
And so we have to be conscious of that. When Alyssa Milano mouths off and when all these other folks are standing up, the good news is it raises the conversation. The bad news is that those who are in favor of abortion rights are also emboldened, and they're also getting stronger, and they're also getting louder. And again, this is where Christians, we are the only group in the country that is going to stand in the gap for these babies and their moms, and we need to get to standing in the gap.
That's interesting. As you're talking about that, and it's like, okay, so it's emboldening both sides to almost like to culminate with this epic battle, right? It says what it seems like in my head as you were saying that. Is there a way that this can even be done in a fair way? I don't know what word to say here, but like in a like where we're coming together to figure this out, or is it going to end up like where an explosion, like a collision of forces, and like even being to the point where there's a massive division in our country as a response to that? In your opinion, I mean, realistically, I'm not the flowery view of all of this or anything like that. Just like the gut punch, I mean,
I'm not a future prophet or a future teller. I don't know. What I do know is that it's a clash of worldviews, and you could not have two more opposite worldviews clashing.
Right.
And how that ends throughout history, takes all sorts of forms. But the reality is that, as much as we hear that you don't legislate morality, that's the purpose of laws. And so making abortion unthinkable and unavailable is both making it illegal, and it needs to be, but also making it unthinkable to where the culture finds abortion reprehensible. And there's historic precedent for that. You have William Wilberforce and slavery in the Western world. That's exactly what he did. Slavery was made illegal, but it was also made culturally reprehensible. So that's the goal. And the question is, how does one worldview take precedent over another worldview? Which is a fascinating discussion here, again, because the pro-life worldview is based on the Christian worldview.
Yeah.
So we had a Christian worldview. Over the last 150 years, we've lost the Christian worldview, and you have a secular humanist worldview, which drives the abortion conversation now, which is almost entirely pervasive in our culture. So how does that get reversed again for the betterment and welfare of everybody? I'm not smart enough to answer that question, but that's the clash. And I think, your question is wise. We need to contemplate how that happens. I would argue a spiritual revival and a renewal of our Christian heritage is essential. And again, it sounds like I'm picking on the church, but I am.
The
church has got to lead that charge.
Yeah. So when you say unthinkable, when you're talking about William Wilberforce, and I guess we had the same thing, well, with the Jews, right? Like, I guess, is that what you were talking about, or were you talking about something else? William Wilberforce was in World War
ended
II.
slavery. No, he was a British parliamentarian who.
Oh yeah, okay.
For ending
Who
slavery.
am I talking to? Oh, I'm talking about anyway.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, Bonhoeffer. Yeah. Okay, so but inside of that, the unthinkable aspect of that. So we've actually seen this. You brought up an interesting point because I've never really thought of that, but we've actually seen things become unthinkable in a lifetime, like smoking, even to some degree, even though we have that, but it's like, and that comes through. I mean, I know you're still, what I love about it is you have the nuts and bolts and you're still plugging away and you're making it happen. And I know the longer you're in the battle, the more battle hardened you get, right? And so you're kind of in that. So definitely going to be lifting you up in prayers and stuff, man, because that's something I don't think that we think enough about, as people on the sidelines, right? Of kind of like the people in the fight.
But it's not a bitter. I mean, I got asked in an interview last week, how does it that you don't become embittered and sort of fall apart? I said, hey, look, I sit in an office and there's a TV screen above my head that several times a day clicks up numbers, and it now reads almost 12,500. That's 12,500 human lives that have been saved.
That's amazing.
So, if we were to do all this to save one child, it would have been worth it. But by God's grace, He's given us 12,500. We're on pace to rescue 4,000 babies this year. So that's extraordinary. I mean, that's a joy. That's an incredible joy. My frustrations are legitimate, but from a supple standpoint, my heart is still raring to go. I'm good for until the Lord has me in this work, which in my hope is that I'm here until abortion ends. Yeah. And the driver is to see women whose lives have been changed, who are weeping with joy that somebody cared enough to come alongside them and help them. None of those 12,500 women who chose life were ticked off when their baby were born.
Yeah.
They were all excited and grateful and thankful. And, you do that enough times and, we'll get our culture changed.
And quite the opposite, to be honest with you, in that regard, when you were talking about none of those women were angry that they were able to save their baby, because, we were talking about this before the show, but I was 16, or I'm sorry, my mom was 16 years old. My dad was 18 when I was born, right? They could have just as easily gone that route because I was born in 78. This was after Roe versus Wade. So it wasn't unthinkable, at that point. So, I'm constantly, whenever I do have the time to think about that or it comes across, I'm incredibly thankful, that they chose life because as a result of that, and this is something I want to encourage you in, it's not just those 12,500. I don't know what the average child, per woman is like 2.5, something like that. But that's incrementally in compounding, right? Generationally. Yep. Like at the end of the day, man, you guys would have been responsible for millions and millions of people being saved as a result of saving that 12,500, which is incredible. So good job, man. That's awesome. So let's kind of shift gears here. Like the Alyssa Milano thing, let's go back to that because she's out there all over the news, and for some reason she became this public figurehead for this whole pro-abortion thing, and now she's throwing out there this whole sex strike thing, which I think is interesting because that's kind of the whole point, right, of what we're fighting for. It's like I'm wondering, like from that perspective, because it brought up something to me. It's like her positioning on that and trying to get that movement built around that. It really seems like a struggle for control at the end of the day. Right? Yeah,
it's
like I can say what's up with my own body, so it seems more like it's coming from that area.
Which is a falsehood. I mean, I've debated pro-abortion advocates who says, my body, my choice, and of course, the pro-life response to that is, well, how many bodies are we talking about? It's not just your body. But again, the pro-abortion movement has gone to just ignoring the child altogether. Yeah, and it basically maintaining that the child doesn't exist. You have. It's ironic because early feminists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Alice Paul were fighting for women's right to vote, and they were pro-life.
Yeah.
They understood that abortion was the ultimate exploitation of women. But New Wave feminism, the feminism today basically says that, men are pigs and women are the new rulers, and they need to have complete what they think is bodily autonomy. So you have feminism that has been so corrupted; it's no longer actual feminism. It's a form of religion,
right?
That is so warped and corrupted that it's become somewhat unintelligible. You have modern feminism, which by its nature has to clash with all the gender wars that are going on, because those two things don't mix very well. So you have this chaos and confusion when we have the transgender debate and the gay rights debate, and you have feminism. Feminism is losing its authority because it can't withstand the other ideas related to gender bias and gay rights.
Right.
Because if we're now not saying there is no such thing as a woman, well, feminism loses its grip. So you see feminists struggling to maintain an apologetic, a worldview, because it's been corrupted, in the last 50 years. But now it's embattled with this whole discussion of what is a boy, what is a girl, who gets to choose gender, how many genders are there, and it becomes nonsense. And the feminist movement knows that.
Yeah.
So they're getting louder and louder, and at the same time still trying to be liked by all these other movements that frankly are leaving feminism behind.
Interesting. So they're kind of a byproduct of their own nonsense to some degree, it sounds like.
It's a terrible result of what was initiated as, frankly, a beautiful biblical worldview. To promote women as equal is godly, it's right, it's biblical. To maintain and to promote the right to vote is absolutely right. To make sure that women have equal rights is a good thing, but it's swung so far to the left that it's become incomprehensible.
That's good. So back to kind of the point of all of this, right, is like, what is keeping men from being more engaged in preserving the life of our unborn? Like men specifically.
Well, and I'm a man, so I don't want to be too critical. But as a gender, we've just become so wussified that we're not particularly relevant. When we're addicted to porn and we care more about sports than we care about our families, and when we are sleeping around before marriage and during marriage, and when we're basically exist to gratify ourselves, we lose the warrior instinct. We're no longer warriors, we're now wusses. And so you have a culture which is demanding that. The feminist movement is demanding that. The gender wars are demanding that men no longer lead, that we no longer stand for something, that we're no longer chivalrous, that we're no longer the providers and protectors of our home, because now that feels icky. Now we're not being what the culture demands of us. And, we as a gender have allowed that. And to some degree, we deride men who are godly men. We now point at them and say, well, you're the problem, when in fact they're the example. So I think, men have become so distracted with pleasure and entertainment, and have become so, and many of us have been raised this way, raised in homes where we weren't raised to be warriors, we weren't raised to be protectors. We don't know what the role of a man should be. Many of us, not me, but many men were raised without fathers entirely. That, we take the path of least resistance, which is, I'm going to live for myself. I'm going to do what makes me happy. I'm going to stay out of the way. I'm going to stay out of the fire. I'm going to stay out of the confrontation. And by the way, we come about that sin naturally, because that was Adam's problem, right? Standing in the garden next to his wife when she was tempted, and he basically said, yeah, whatever you want to do is fine. So that's what the man says when his wife wants to go to the abortion clinic. Well, I'll support you, whatever you decide. Same deal generations later. And until we as a gender regain biblical masculinity and the servant leadership and honoring women properly, we're going to continue to be wussified. And, that's by and large what we got.
So what are we missing as men in this whole, fight for life for our unborn and stuff? Like, what is it that we're not grasping that we should be grasping? Like our responsibility in that, our role in that, our right in that kind of thing.
Well, it comes down to, what are we missing is a proper biblical sexual ethic and a biblical view of women.
Okay.
So, we're trained, watch enough TV, it looks like every woman is a sexual, beast who wants to have sex with men all the time. Any of us that are married and in godly marriages understand that that's not biblical, nor is that reality, right? So men have to get restored to a biblical view of themselves, a biblical view of women, and a biblical view of human sexuality. When the divorce rate, it's identity, but it's also courage. I mean, what's missing is courage. That's the bottom line.
Right.
We have to have the courage to confront how we behave and say, are we going to behave as God wants us to, or are we going to behave as we want to?
Yeah.
Do we have the courage to submit ourselves to a biblical view of manhood and to behave, to serve our wives, to lay our lives down for our wives, to flee from sexual immorality and temptation because that's what's best for our wives and our children,
Right.
to self-sacrifice and to start sucking up and living like, the warriors that we're born to be.
Yeah.
And that takes courage. There's lots of excuses why that doesn't happen. I get it. But, the real reason why we abort 61 million children, why we have, is because Christian men, in my view, I wrote a book about it, just have not stood in the gap and said, we're going to protect our families. We're going to protect our wives. We're going to protect our girlfriends. We're going to protect the female gender. We're going to honor them. We're going to protect them. We're going to empower them. And instead of basically said, hey, I got what I needed last night. Good luck. See ya.
Yeah. So for the guys that, though, do care and that want to be a part of the solution, how can they do that?
Education is the first step. I've learned through a lot of years of doing this, and again, I'm not picking on the entire gender. There are fantastic men all across the country who are warriors and who are protectors and providers. So, I want these guys to take my comments in stride.
Sure. Yeah.
Getting educated is the first step. You got to know what's going on in your own church and in your own community. If you're a pro-life Christian guy, and you sit a year in church and you never hear the word abortion from your pastor's mouth, it's time to find a new church. Seriously. Because this is the biggest issue of our age, and we're responsible.
Yeah.
So if you go to a church that's evangelical, nice people sing good songs, you hear nice sermons, but your pastor is not up there regularly talking about the sin of abortion and the genocide and the harm to women, you're in the wrong church. Yeah. So get yourself in an environment where you can be educated in your church community. There's a ton of resources, books online. Understand what the abortion genocide is and how it's impacting your family, your community, your church family, and then get engaged. God will lead you. He'll show you where he wants you to go. It might be in your local church. It might be with a pregnancy center. It might be with an activist organization. It might be politically. It might be with Human Coalition. Whatever works. But the real question, Corey, is if our country was killing 3,000 5-year-olds every day, how would we as men get involved? Same question. So every man listening or watching this should be asking themselves, if there were 15,000 children in Dallas, 5-year-olds in Dallas that were being killed every year, slaughtered on playgrounds, how would I get involved? Well, that's how we need to get involved with abortion.
That's good. I think that's a big part. So the good news is there's all kinds of alternatives out there about what can be done. So let's see here. You were talking earlier about kind of what it does to women, but I've known both women and men that have gone through this, like from the man being a supporter of that. And, like the media and these organizations that are out there protesting a lot of in favor of abortion, they make it sound like this is just some giant party. And my experience with people that have gone through this, and, I want to be sympathetic to some of the guys that may have gone through this for sure, is that like they're messed up by it. Like there's things that happened inside of that, and that decision that they made to take another life and to kind of do whatever was going to be inside of that is now affecting them, long term. And this is something that doesn't just go away the minute you walk out of that abortion clinic.
Right.
It's so much bigger than that.
The beautiful, wonderful irony of being a Christian is that as much as we fight against the abortion machine and we want the killing to stop, we also understand that the cross of Christ is bigger than the sin of abortion.
Right.
So, if 1/3 of men and 1/3 of women in the country have had an abortion, and that statistically is probably pretty close, you're talking about tens of millions of people we work with, people we're in families with, people we step by on the street every day. And many of them don't know that Christ has forgiven that sin.
Right.
It's a terrible sin. It takes a life. I'm not minimizing it. I'm just saying that that's how big the cross of Christ is. And so churches have the opportunity, if nothing less, to be an extraordinary sense of peace and forgiveness for their congregations just by broadcasting that message loud and clear.
Yeah.
We have post-abortive women and men on staff here. We got 162 people on staff at Human Coalition. Several of them have had abortions in their past. And the men who had abortions will tell you that their suffering is different than women's. Women suffer in very powerful, poignant, terrible ways. Men suffer differently. They compartmentalize it. It sometimes comes out through violence. It sometimes comes out through ambivalence. It sometimes comes out through, porn use or having affairs. The guilt erodes the moral compass inside. But we suffer. Many have likened it to like a PTSD. It's very similar to PTSD symptoms. And there is very little discussion about how to help post-abortive men. Most of the post-abortive recovery ministries exist for women. There are a few that exist for men, but the reality is that much of what we see in man's behavior, much of what we see in the violence in our culture, I have every reason to believe stems from the abortion culture that lays an evil foundation to that violence.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. I think, and the complete lack of regard for human life in general that we're seeing in a lot of ways, for sure.
That's right.
So one last question here. If you had the right support, would Human Coalition have the wherewithal to be the force that would actually stop abortion in this lifetime and make it unthinkable?
Not by ourselves. The effort to end abortion is a coalition. That's part of the reason why we're named Human Coalition. We are we're a leading organization by God's grace. We're only 10 years old, and we're the largest pro-life organization in the country. We give God all the glory for that. At the same time, that comes with a holy charter, a holy obligation to continue that work. So the answer is we want to continue to lead that effort, and along with other leaders, and we want to bring along anybody and everybody who wants to be a part of this. And there are, 4,000 pro-life organizations across the country. We want every one of them to be rapidly successful. We do. We want every one of them to be able to execute their missions and their visions, and to be blessed financially, and to be able to do their work as long as they abide by biblical principles, and most of them are. And we have a chance, to really coalesce that movement. So we're going to fulfill God's call in our lives personally and corporately. We've grown 10 times in the last 5 years. We want to do it again in the next 5 years. And we pray that God is setting us up to do that. And it's not so we can have our names in lights or frankly that, we come under criticism. It's because we want to get to the next baby as fast as humanly possible. We want to save the next child from abortion. And we pray that God would give us the grace and the wisdom to do that.
That's awesome. Brian, this was an awesome interview. I really appreciated you. Extremely articulate and just the way that you have such a command of your space and all that, man. I really, it was a joy to interview you.
Oh, thanks.
Dude, anything I can do to help. Why don't you let everybody know how they can get a hold of you or how they can get involved? Because I do want men involved in this.
Sure. You can reach out to us at humancoalition.org. That's the website, humancoalition.org. If you want to check out the podcast, that's at thehumanelementshow.com, thehumanelementshow.com. It's a weekly pro-life podcast. It's a lot of fun, very educational. It's a good way to just kind of get your arms and head around what's going on in the culture related to pro-life and pro-abortion. And you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/humancoalition.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. And if you're catching this on a replay, share this thing out. Get the word out for what they're doing, what Brian and the guys at Human Coalition are doing, the men and women. It's big work, and it's something that they're not going to be able to do by themselves. We've got to all kind of do our part to get involved there, and we can make an impact inside of that. I know that culture tells us that we don't have a right or the ability to stand in and tell women what to do with their bodies. It's all based on a lie, and real people are being hurt with that, and some are not ever seeing the light of day. And so we have the ability to stop that, or at least make a huge dent in that. So I want to encourage you guys, please just take the time to educate yourself inside of that. And, even if it means one life, just because of how you got involved, that's huge. Generationally, that can turn into so much more. So Brian, thanks again for being here. And if there's ever anything that we can do for you, just feel free to ask. Everybody else, y'all have a great day. We'll talk to you later.